Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Monday edition here of Point of View, and sometimes I am amazed at how much happens over the weekend. I honestly could fill 2 or 3 hours without having a guest, but we do have some great guests that we're going to be talking about as well. And first off, we'll talk about the fact that it's Martin Luther King Day, and might just make a connection, as our good friend Lathan Watts did, between Religious Freedom Day, which was Saturday, and Martin Luther King Day, which is today. And I think it's a very good piece, and it's one of the articles we've posted. Matter of fact, it's the first article for you to read, and so I think you will appreciate that. Then we'll get into the ongoing debate and discussion about whether or not a president who is no longer the president can be impeached. Alan Dershowitz over the weekend had some comments to say about that, so we'll get into this. A growing number of people that are saying, is it possible to sue Twitter? I was asked that the other day, and even yesterday I meant to answer some of those questions in my Sunday school class, although I was controversial enough in my Sunday school class, didn't need to talk about that as well, but that is the case. And in light of that, the purge is continuing. I've got a commentary coming out next week on the big tech purge. If you haven't been paying attention, the CEO of Mozilla says it's not enough just to deplatform these individuals. We have to do much more than that. Over the weekend, you had an individual that was an officer with CNN saying it's time for Verizon and AT&T and others to deplatform One America News Network and Newsmax, so we'll get into some of that. One of the other articles I have is by Representative Dan Crenshaw, which turned out to be really quite a fascinating article. He was simply talking about some of the illogic about lockdowns. But before we're through, we're getting into some of the brain studies that we've done and risk issues and things of that nature, and so we'll talk about that as well. Piece by Senator Ben Sasse, which I'll probably save to the National Hour, on QAnon and a number of others that are related to that as well. And, of course, this whole push now to penalize anybody that questioned the elections. Now a petition at Harvard saying we need to pull the Harvard law degree from Ted Cruz, the law degree from Kelly McNamara, the undergraduate degree, which I did. I know Dan Crenshaw, some saying that they should be actually censured by the Senate. Maybe they should be forced to resign. I mean, it's getting pretty amazing. All part of what I call kind of the purge. Some of that happened in big tech. Some of it happened in the government. So we'll get into all of those issues. And I doubt we'll cover all of that in the first hour. Don't even think that we will. But next hour, we'll have Ethan Richardson with us. He's a contributor and editor of, or at least former editor of, the Mockingbird magazine. He's got a good piece on waiting on the new thing coming. Sometimes we face this issue of hurry up and wait, and more importantly, how to just kind of think through some of these issues in a time of so much stress. You know, be still and know that I am God is maybe in the Psalms, but we sometimes don't necessarily practice that, so we'll talk about this. And then in the next hour, George Barna will be with us. He's done a post-election survey, which I thought was appropriate before this election completely fades into the distant memory. That article coming out just today, so you'll be hearing it for the first time, and all sorts of other topics that I haven't even mentioned that we will get into. So a lot to cover, and it's amazing because when we said goodbye on Friday, most of these articles were not in my hand. Well, the first one was by Lathan Watts. I knew it was coming out, and I told Lathan, yeah, we ought to talk about that on Monday, and we will. because he makes a connection between the Religious Freedom Day, which was Saturday, and Martin Luther King Day, and says there's really a link between the two. And I won't go into all the details because it is the first article on our website for you to read. But he says, you know, without the freedom that certainly Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement possessed, endowed to him by the Creator and protected by the First Amendment, he might not have been able to issue this clarion call for his country to succeed where the forefathers had failed, and talk about that promise that was uncashed. And so he goes into the fact that in so doing, whether it's the civil rights movement or going all the way back to the Pilgrims, the pastors, and the preachers from various denominations, they were all involved in a variety of different causes. American independence in the 18th century, abolition of slavery in the 19th century. He didn't add this, but I would talk about the suffrage movement and a variety of others, and of course the civil rights movement in the 20th century, all which were actually led from individuals who were pastors, preachers, or evangelists. He goes on to even talk about the fact that our founding fathers knew that because all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that the first duty of mankind is to express gratitude to the Creator. He says this is the essence of worship. The founders also knew it was not for government to decide how or if that gratitude would be expressed. Any attempt to compel men to think one way or think another way would be a violation of conscience, hence the two clauses of the First Amendment. And he goes into an explanation, which we've talked about before, of the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. So this is a piece that on Martin Luther King Day, oftentimes I've done commentaries in the past where I talk about the letter from the Birmingham jail, but I thought this might be a different sort of look at the connection between religious freedom and Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement and other social movements in our society. But just before we take a break, Alan Dershowitz, who's been on the program with us a couple of times, of course, a former professor of law at Harvard and a constitutional lawyer as well. So far, no evidence that Harvard wants to pull his degree, but we'll see where that goes. But nevertheless, he was on an interview, Sunday Morning Futures. I'm glad they rate because I do not watch these shows. First of all, I'm in church, but second of all, I don't watch them. But nevertheless, he said that there should be no jurisdiction that you can put a citizen Trump on trial. He says if you could do that, it would be putting someone on trial who is not a sitting president. And he says that the implications of that would be horrendous. He says if you can impeach anyone who is not sitting on a particular position or not holding a particular position, like a sitting president, there are no limits, he says, to the power of the Congress to try ordinary citizens. And he says it's plainly unconstitutional, and the Senate should not proceed with this unconstitutional act. Because he's been a professor at Harvard, he did make a comment about the fact that they are trying to now rescind the degrees of these various individuals, either people that have worked for Donald Trump, like Kayleigh McEnany. By the way, most people don't know she's got a Harvard Law degree. Or Ted Cruz. I think most people know he had a Harvard Law degree. As a matter of fact, Alan Dershowitz said, I didn't agree with Ted Cruz, but he really was one of the most bright individuals I ever had in the Harvard Law class. And then Dan Crenshaw, which I did not know had a Harvard degree as well. We'll quote from him a little bit later. But this has been an attempt to actually do that. And it has been interesting to see some of the people raising questions about whether that should be done. One of those, not surprising, is an individual we've been quoting a number of times who is quite liberal on some of those issues, but nevertheless, Glenn Greenwald has said this is really ridiculous for a variety of reasons. So I will read that after the break, but first of all, get into a couple of other issues, because the whole question of censorship. Kevin McCullough points out why some people think they can sue Twitter. And our good friend Jim Dennison points out why censorship is on the increase. And he's got some good reasons and some bad reasons that we want to surface. But we need to take one of those mandatory breaks. So he will do, though. And we'll be back right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Now that the state legislatures are back in session, one of the more significant functions this year will be reapportionment. After the census is completed, the states must reapportion the congressional districts. This is necessary for two reasons. First, the populations within states change. Second, the population of states vary because of migration from one state to another. Reapportionment will affect two issues. The allocation of the 435 seats in the House of Representatives is done by population within a state. Many states will lose one or more seats, while others will gain one or more seats. This will also impact the Electoral College. The number of electors is based on the number of members of Congress. According to an unofficial Census Bureau estimate, many of the blue states will lose members of the House of Representatives. For example, New York could lose one or two congressional seats depending on which estimate is used. It could lose one seat if the April 1st population estimate is used. It could lose two seats if the July 1st estimate is used. Other states that will lose a congressional representatives are California, Illinois, Michigan, Minnesota, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, and West Virginia. Before I list the states that will pick up a congressional seat, we should mention that this is the first time in its history that California will lose a seat. Also consider that New York was the most populous state in the Union until 1964. It is now fourth and losing population nearly every day. The biggest winner in all of this is Texas, that will gain 3 additional seats. Florida will gain 2. Other states to gain a seat are Arizona, Colorado, North Carolina, and Oregon. And a large number of the state legislatures doing reapportionment are controlled by Republicans. So I predict that more Republicans will be serving in Congress in the future. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of the booklet, A Biblical View on Pornography, go to viewpoints.info/pornography. That's viewpoints.info/pornography.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Once again, one of the things people are talking about is suing Twitter. I am not advocating that, and I don't necessarily think it's going to go anywhere, but I could be wrong. But I'm certainly not advocating that. But I thought, just to be fair, let's talk about why some people think there may be a case. And it isn't so much on the issue of censorship per se. It has to do with something that really I had not really thought through very much, and that has to do with the fact that what you are talking about are a couple of reasons why that is a possible lawsuit in terms of just the mismanagement of this platform. And in other words, the suit would come from like shareholders or people like that. Kevin McCullough has been on the program with us before. It's been a while. And he says there have been dozens of conversations by former Twitter users that thousands of people might not be eligible to sue Big Tweet, but expect a bit of payday in doing so. So the bottom line is maybe that happens. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe there's a payday. Maybe there's not. But he gives a couple of reasons, and one of those is monopolization. Obviously, he says it's been discussed in Washington that the predatory aspect of Twitter's self-sheriffing or misinformation reached all-time levels of interference of free speech in the election cycle. We've talked about that before. He also talks about Rule 230 because, as we've mentioned before, there is the Communications Decency Act, and Section 230 says that they are platforms, and a platform is one that allows all sorts of things to be expressed whereas a publisher is very different. I'll get to that in just a minute because Jim Dennison does a good job of talking about that. But then he goes into a second, or actually I guess this would be now a third reason, and that is double standards in rule enforcement. As part of the purge last week, he says, my own Twitter channel, that would be Kevin McCullough's, was suspended for supposed threat of violence. We appealed. We disagreed with the reading of the post and all of the rest. Know him to know well enough that sometimes if you just simply say we should express our opinion, that could sometimes be seen as violent, and so it was used that. But interestingly enough, he had David Marcus on the program, on his radio program, who's a writer for The Federalist, who described the wide range of threats that do exist and are still found on Twitter. You know, I had somebody yesterday who works in the tech industry tell me that one of the reasons they wanted to pull Parler is there was no rule enforcement. There's no way that you could appeal some of that. Okay, that might be an argument. But even with the rule up there, you have a number of the assassinate Trump, kill Trump kinds of things still up there. Of course, you have the account for the supreme leader of Iran still on the website and all sorts of other things on Twitter, I guess I should say. And so that double standard issue was one. But I thought the most interesting one of the arguments has to do with money. And, of course, you know how money always speaks, especially in a court case. He says, look, I'm not a lawyer, but when you look at what's called fiduciary liability, he says, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not an investment or financial planning expert, but I've worked enough with media companies to know that one of the things that is the primary discussion of media companies is on audience. And just think about this, and it had not even crossed my mind. When you pull out Donald Trump, just him alone, and of course I've made a list, and I even posted those yesterday in my Sunday school class, of this growing list of individuals that have been either permanently banned off of Twitter or banned for long periods of time. That's pretty significant. But let's just pick on the president for a minute. President Donald Trump, if you look at the various tweets, response to tweets and everything, he probably delivered, are you ready for this number? 117 billion impressions. 117, because these are tweets and retweets and things like that. Okay. And you got about 300 million consumers. So think about that. Just forget whether you like Donald Trump or don't. Just think about that from an audience standpoint, because those impressions are being paid for by advertisers, and advertisers want what? Eyeballs. And you just killed the golden goose that was producing so many eyeballs for so many advertisers. And I thought, I'd never thought about that before. So anyway, he goes through this and he says, investors like this because they like this idea of all these people watching and reading these, because then Twitter can sell ads to ensure people see them. And if you add to President Trump's loss of audience the simultaneous prevention of consumers from being able to access his tweets, you can see what that actually hits. And so I'm not saying that you should sue Twitter. I'm not saying it's a good idea. I just really don't have enough information about that. But Kevin McCullough got me thinking about some things I had never thought about before. Once you pull out the golden goose who had been laying these golden eggs that all the advertisers want, maybe that's not always the best thing in the long-term future of a particular platform like Twitter. But very, very well written, as always, Jim Dennison daily article today, in which he points out that really, if you want to do any kind of objective analysis, censorship is escalating, and there's some good reasons for censorship and some bad reasons, and I had that conversation with some of the people in my Sunday school class. The first is that our nation is facing genuine threats, and so do you want to have a platform where there's no censorship? Think about sex trafficking. Do you want to censor sex trafficking on the internet? Of course you do. I don't care if you're a liberal, a conservative, a Republican, or a Democrat. You want that, right? Limited. It gets a little maybe a little gray when you start talking about pornography, but I think most people would at least agree child pornography should be limited, and yet child pornography is exploding online. Would you agree about cyber terrorism, cyber terrorist threats? Well, okay, so you can begin to see that sometimes, even though we say we want to have a free flow of information, that's what the internet was all about, censorship makes sense when we're talking about at least some places where we can agree, like sex trafficking, child pornography, cyber terrorism, and a number. So let's acknowledge that sometimes we do censor. Of course we do. Number two, he says the other reason it's escalating, and this one relates to us as Christians, is that non-evangelicals consider biblical morality to be prejudiced and hateful. And again, you will be censored if you say something about homosexuality. Of course, frankly, you'll be censored if you even have a question about the election. You will certainly be censored if you want to, as we'll talk about later, talk about QAnon and things like that. And anything that you might disagree with from a liberal point of view is oftentimes labeled as hate speech, and it is censored as well. And then the final reason that Jim Dennison talks about that is censorship is escalating because our culture has no objective basis for determining value. Relates very much to an article I found, which I then sent to him to maybe read as well, because a lot of people are talking about the impact of liberalism and postmodernism. Matter of fact, one of the articles I sent to Jim Dennison, you might want to read, was by a person that I'm sure could not sign the doctrinal statement of your church, or maybe wouldn't even necessarily agree with most of the things we say around this program, but nevertheless recognizes that postmodernism, postmodern relativism probably is the term that Jim Dennison uses, has convinced our culture that all truth claims are personal and subjective, so we really don't have a basis to decide what is right and what is wrong. And if anything, some of the views that you have are considered by definition wrong. And so that brings us to the attempt for further purging. And I mentioned just a few minutes ago that you have, of course, the CEO of Mozilla saying that we should deplatform people, but that's not enough. Just the temporary silencing or even permanent removal of bad actors is not enough. And again, over the weekend, you had the former Facebook chief security officer, that's Alex Stamos, called for carriers like Verizon and AT&T to completely deplatform One American News Network, OANN, and you may have seen that one before, and Newsmax. He was on a CNN interview just making that case. So the purge is not draining or fading. It seems to almost be increasing. And every day somebody's finding one other thing to pull. And so we come back from the break. One thing they want to pull are the degrees for some of these individuals. And our friend Glenn Greenwald, who is a liberal and an individual that, again, would disagree with many things said around this table. Nevertheless, got to love him. He is a very honest liberal, and his piece that just came out the other day is which he was taking on this attempt to revoke the degrees of those individuals, and he gives us some very good reasons why that makes no sense, including his argument that it probably won't stand constitutional muster, but who knows in this current environment. And then we'll get into some of the other issues, in particular, the issue of the lockdowns, the vaccines, and even a vaccine bill of rights. So there's a lot more to cover, and we will do that right after these important messages.
Sometimes I think about seeds. You ever stop to consider that some seeds become entire trees and some trees grow up and produce fruit? Other seeds become flowers or vines that bring us vegetables or berries. And some trees don't have fruit, but they're just pretty, especially in some parts of the country when it comes to the fall colors. Yes, sometimes my mind goes off like that. And I also think about such things when it comes to the seeds that so many have planted in the quest to impact our nation through Point of View Radio. You may think that your gift is a small thing, but like a seed, it can grow to have an impact beyond your imagination. If you want to see beauty again in America, consider planting a seed today and making a difference by joining the Point of View Truth Team. Get the details today, right now, by visiting pointofview.net/team or call us at 1-800-347-5151. Plant a seed for a great future. Cultivate truth. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again,
is Kerby Anderson.
Once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Ethan Richardson will be with us in about a half an hour. In about an hour and a half from now, we'll have George Barna. But in between, we still have a lot more to talk about. And one of those, which I did not post, but it might be worth doing sometime if this becomes an issue, is this piece from Glenn Greenwald. Glenn Greenwald is an individual who calls himself left of center, does not agree with Donald Trump. Matter of fact, at one point said he even disagreed with this whole challenge of the election, but he also points out it's not fair to actually pull somebody's degree because you disagree with something they said in the halls of Congress. So I do appreciate that. And right now there's a campaign at Harvard University to rescind the degrees of Trump officials and allies, including, of course, the press secretary, Kayleigh McEnany, Senator Ted Cruz, Representative Dan Crenshaw. And I'm going to quote from Dan Crenshaw in just a minute. And just the other day, I noticed that Representative Elise Stefanik was removed from one of the boards there on Harvard simply because she had questions about the election, about some of the election irregularities. And he said, first of all, that revocation of degrees would result in immediate and likely successful court challenges. He says, I cannot imagine a court allowing such an action to occur on this basis. Yes, he doesn't live in my world, but I appreciate his confidence. More importantly, he says it's wrong. It's using academic degrees as a vehicle for political expression and retaliation. And part of the argument which is being made, and he rejects, and I do as well, is that the petition is saying that a Harvard degree is a privilege, not a right. Harvard had no qualms about rescinding the offers of admission to high school students because of something they said online, sometimes maybe when they were 15 years of age, 12 years of age. And so holding teenagers accountable is easy. Harvard should hold adults to the same standards. Well, again, talk about apples and oranges, or apples and aardvarks or something like that. I mean, just crazy. But again, he says, I fundamentally disagreed with those individuals who had a challenge of the electoral votes. But he said, still, the effort to seek such retaliation is not just fueling our divisions, but it is part of a widening campaign against free speech. I gotta appreciate him saying that. And again, his argument is, again, this idea that you're trying to compare the decision to rescind an offer of admission to a high school student because of something they might have said on Snapchat years ago, I first of all think is wrong, but it's to compare that to an adult asking some fundamental questions about the election. And he says that's very different between withdrawing an offer of admission and revoking an earned degree. And most importantly, he says he's also concerned about the fact that the faculty members have joined with Harvard and others, creating a blacklist and taking retaliatory actions for anybody that was involved in any action that they might disagree with. And of course, we used to talk about blacklists, but that goes back to the days in which that was, I thought, actually seen as inappropriate. But nevertheless, one of the people that they have targeted is Representative Dan Crenshaw. And I've posted, this is the third article we posted here. To understand the illogical lockdowns, we must understand the left's thinking. And he said, first of all, lockdowns are back with us. Many of us, it would appear as if the entire human race has learned absolutely nothing in the past 8 months, despite the overwhelming evidence that the cost of lockdowns far outweighs the limited benefits. We've talked about that on this program many times. There have been some very good books written about that now. Many policies makers are back to it once again. And, of course, he talks about some of these internet memes. You know, if a lockdown worked the first time, why are we doing it again? And if a lockdown didn't work the first time, why are we doing it again? You know, so that's part. But then he goes into something I didn't expect as I started reading through the article, because he helps us understand that there are striking differences, as I think we've already illustrated, between the way people that are more conservative view the virus and the way people that are more liberal or progressive view the virus. He said, for example, in Washington, D.C., I regularly see people wearing masks while walking alone in a park. In Texas, I almost never observe this. And then he goes on to say that there's pretty interesting research that shows that Republicans and Democrats differ in their neural mechanisms. That's what's in their brain, which are activated during risk-taking exercises. That's part of what's called the amygdala region. Anyway, And so then he illustrates that in a number of ways. First of all, you notice that conservatives tend to be more likely to take physically riskier jobs, military, law enforcement, even logging and things like that. And he says that's a really, as he goes through it, lengthy way of explaining this simple observation. Conservatives appear to be less risk averse to physical threats, therefore far less likely to favor more extreme actions. And so as a result, but again, he says, for the liberal mind, there is a belief that almost anything can be solved by government. Then he goes through some research, and it's research done by Dr. Jonathan Haidt, who's been on the program with us. He's the one that was the co-author of the book, Coddling of the American Mind, and he's done surveys across different countries. Yes, you're going to get a commentary from me on this one. It's very interesting. And that found that liberals emphasize caring and fairness above other moral concerns. Conservatives, on the other hand, favor all moral categories more equally, placing emphasis not just on compassion, but on a fair process, moral authority, tradition, liberty, and loyalty. And so the point he's making is something I've seen and found in Jonathan Haidt's book on one of his other books, other than Coddling the American Mind, that conservatives tend to be on moral issues more morally balanced, whereas liberals measure the worth of an action by compassion. That's the number one goal. So he says it's no surprise then that liberals routinely denigrate contextualized COVID-19 data, such as when somebody dies of the virus, have we accounted for age, comorbidities, and a variety of others? And liberals say, well, you're just downplaying the virus, or you're covering for Trump or whatever. And he says, as a result, sometimes some of these rational discussions become impossible if people perceive you as morally inferior. So anyway, Dan Crenshaw really not only takes us through why do we see such a difference between, say, Republicans and Democrats on lockdowns, on masks, on the threat of the pandemic. Well, he takes us to brain research. I found it fascinating, and if you'd like to read it for yourself, it's the third article we've posted on the website. Which brings us to the whole question of the vaccines. And this is kind of an interesting set of circumstances, because the other day you may have seen, if you're out there on Twitter or Facebook, a claim that 55 people in America have died in this country after receiving the COVID-19 vaccine. And if you actually do a Google search, you'll find that they all go back really to one article on Epoch Times. You don't find anybody else reporting that. By the way, if you do a search on people that have died after receiving the COVID-19 vaccine, you will find an incredible number of stories of 23 people in Norway that have died receiving the vaccine. Now, the argument, again, is that many of those 23, 13 were in nursing homes who were at least 80 years of age and may have reacted to the side effects of the vaccine. But again, I want to ask the same question we always ask, whether you died with COVID-19 or from COVID-19. Here's the same question. Did you die because you received the vaccine, or were you already at a very vulnerable state so that the vaccine's side effects might have put you over? It's maybe a little bit of an issue that needs to be addressed, but nevertheless is significant. And coming back to that original article, it turns out that study comes from the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, which, to be fair to at least Epoch Times, because I'm going to say I think this was completely an erroneous statement and conclusion, they do at least acknowledge that oftentimes the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System lacks details, sometimes has inaccurate information. And the fact that nobody else has covered it means that I would be real hesitant to accept this idea that 55 people in America have died because they took the vaccine. Have some people had difficulties? Yes, because they do have some anecdotes there. And some people may have been pushed over the edge because of some of those side effects. But I think this is a good example of read widely. And if you only see one source for a story, might be possible that story is not accurate. But just before we take a break, let me also at least acknowledge Something very interesting. The America Frontline Doctors have now put together what they call a vaccine bill of rights. No person will be mandated, coerced, or forced to pressure to be taking the COVID-19 vaccine. No physician or nurse shall be asked by their employer to promote the COVID-19 vaccine. And all people have the right at all times to determine what is their own best medical interest without threat to their livelihood or freedom of movement. Attempt to maybe get out in front of the idea of having a vaccine passport. We'll probably cover that more in the future, but I just thought I'd mention that just before we take another break. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and then, like I said, we will have Ethan Richardson with us at the top of the hour. Let me go back and correct one of the things that I said. I was just looking through here, and the fourth article we've posted is the one about Harvard degrees, and I actually credited that to Glenn Greenwald, but actually it was by Jonathan Turley, who also is another liberal that I just really appreciate. He is a professor of law at George Washington University, and again, has also said that he would not agree with some of the things Donald Trump said, and he was the one that also disagreed with challenging the election, but nevertheless is just the one that actually wrote this piece. And I made the mistake of just printing it out without having his name on it because it had all sorts of material. I mean, sometimes, you know, when you reprint things, it just doesn't print very well. You hit print and it just runs all over the place. So then you copy and paste. When I copy and pasted and put his name there. Anyway, it's Jonathan Turley that said that. It's the fourth article you can find on the website website on Point of View. Real quickly, let me also mention that there are two things the president is doing, one that I really agree with and one that I strongly disagree with. Before President Trump leaves office, number one, he is declassifying a lot of documents. I think that is really good because we now know some of the people that were involved in this phony dossier that was provided by Christopher Steele. So we'll talk about that in just a minute. He also, before he heads out the door, wants to pardon a whole lot of other people. And I've got a commentary coming out this week in which I point out that this is not the first time, sadly it won't be the last time, in which we have an outgoing president putting forward some really questionable pardons. Bill Clinton, probably the all-time hero or villain, depending on which side of the aisle you look at in terms of some of these pardons. And I suspect some of these are going to be coming down in the next couple of days. But one of the benefits of declassifying some of this information is that there is really no national security threat. And what has now happened with the declassifying so many of these documents is that you have a variety of individuals, John Solomon, who I quoted the other day, or in this case, Art Moore, who points out that now we know where this document, this dossier information came from, and it came from Fiona Hill. Now, if you read this piece, you will see a picture of her actually testifying before the House Intelligence Committee, and she was one of the individuals actually testifying against Donald Trump to call for his first impeachment. Isn't it amazing we have to talk about your first impeachment, second impeachment? And so here, while she's sitting here saying all sorts of negative things about the president, because in that case it was a phone call to the Ukrainian president, before that was Russia, Russia, Russia. We now, through declassified documents, show that indeed, as far as we can determine, she had the distinction, I'm reading from Art Moore here, of introducing the former British spy Christopher Steele to the primary source of the infamous dossier, which turned out to be nothing more than Russian disinformation or Russian propaganda that actually fueled the Russian collusion probe in the first place. And so this is just one of many shoes that over the next couple of days or weeks that will drop, that I am sure the mainstream media will completely ignore. But imagine if the role was reversed and there was an impeachment of, say, Barack Obama, and then we found out that the people testifying against Barack Obama actually were the ones that set him up for the spying in the first place. I mean, we are talking about something that would be front page headlines. But nevertheless, over the next couple of days and weeks, these declassified documents that people like John Solomon, Art Moore, and others are going to be going through, we're going to find all sorts of things and find out that some of the things we did suspect years ago were indeed true. The second article I have here is one by Senator Ben Sasse that appeared in The Atlantic. I found it just the other day and thought it would probably be good to mention, and then now I notice it's even showing up on the Drudge Report, so a lot more people will read it. And the point he's making is he says QAnon is destroying the Republican Party from within. Now, let's be honest. Some of us have even said if you go out right now with a microphone and ask people what QAnon is, you wouldn't get an answer at all. But they are out there. And if you look at some of the video of those individuals that went into the Capitol, stormed the Capitol, many of them were QAnon. Matter of fact, some of them even had a red, white, and blue Q or insignia on their shirts because they wanted everybody to know what they were doing. And what I think is maybe a service that Ben Sasse is providing is to say, look, sometimes we talk about some of the crazy people on the left, and there are a lot of them, but there's some pretty crazy people on the right that need to be addressed as well. And so I won't go through the article because it goes on for pages, but it's the second article. Just wanted you to be able to read it. And he said, until last week, many party leaders, he says, and consultants thought they could preach the Constitution while winking at QAnon. They can't. The GOP must reject conspiracy theories or be consumed by them. Now is the time to decide what the party
Party is about. And so he points out one of these individuals that I've heard people focus on is what he says Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, he says, is cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. She once ranted that there's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to take on this global cabal of Satan-worshiping pedophiles out, and I think we have the president to do it. Well, that gives you a taste of it. And if you're not familiar with QAnon, that's fine, because a lot of people aren't. And maybe what it needs to be is just pushed out. But the point he's making is when she was in the midst of her campaign, the House Minority Leader, Kevin McCarthy, could have just disavowed her campaign. And maybe she'd even lose that seat for a Republican. But instead, she ended up in the Republican caucus, and I'm sure there's a hope to keep her lid on these ideas. But, you know, anybody's got a social media account, they're going to be saying all sorts of crazy things. And so the bottom line is, for some time, Democrats have had difficulty policing their own. Just look at all the crazy things that have been said, just even in the last 48 hours by some of the people in the so-called squad. But the argument is, as long as you got a D next to your name, you're part of us, and we'll just turn a blind eye to anti-Semitism. We'll turn a blind eye to some of the really bizarre statements and comments that are being made, because, after all, we need your vote. And I guess what you have Ben Sass saying is, really, Republicans, you don't need to follow suit. He says if the Republican Party is to have a future outside of the fever dreams of internet trolls, we have to call out falsehoods and conspiracy theories unequivocally. We have to repudiate people who peddle those lies. And he goes on to even explain that this is not just something that he is slightly aware of, but they have actually accused him, and even all the way up to the vice president, of being involved in these conspiracies. And maybe it's about time to simply say, okay, enough is enough. And he recognizes that some of the problem we have right now is what he says, civil authority has ebbed in all sorts of ways. Political incompetence, malpractice during the COVID-19 pandemic have deepened suspicions that some politicians never let a crisis go to waste, you think? He says decisions in California to keep churches closed but to keep open strip bars and marijuana dispensary groups baffle Main Street. And he says even the juxtaposition of a media addict mayor breaking up Hasidic funerals while marching in Black Lives Matter protests not only deepens the cynicism of many Americans, but it has undermined the institutions of public health that should have been cautiously protecting each one of us. So he helps us understand that this is an issue. Is it the biggest issue? Probably not. Is it an issue that needs to be addressed? Yes. That's why we posted it. And so if nothing else, if you want to learn a little bit more about QAnon or what the Republican Party needs to do, it's the second article on our website, pointofview.net. Let me also mention that my Viewpoints commentary today is on reapportionment. I think it's going to be one of the big battles in every state legislature in the country, especially right here in the state of Texas. So we're going to take a break. We come back, we'll spend some time talking with Ethan Richardson about the Mockingbird magazine and waiting on the new thing coming. All that coming up right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Monday edition here of Point of View, and this hour we're going to spend some time, first of all, talking about a great article that appeared in Mockingbird magazine, and something I think will be helpful to you. Then we'll get into all sorts of issues in the news. Today is Martin Luther King Day. Very good first article we've posted by our friend Lathan Watts on the relationship between the Religious Freedom Day, which took place on Saturday, and MLK Day today, and the relationship between religious freedom and some of the social movements in the past, whether it was the, of course, American Revolution, whether it was the abolition of slavery, or all the way up to the civil rights movement. So I think you will appreciate that. Our second article talks about QAnon. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Senator Ben Sasse has written that. Third article on the illogic of lockdowns, a very good piece by Representative Ben Crenshaw to really help us understand why there's such a difference in the perception people have about the pandemic, about vaccines, and a number of other issues. We will, of course, get into the ongoing question of whether or not indeed an impeachment of the president can take place. And then we also have one by Jonathan Turley, really challenging what is being done right now at Harvard University, an attempt to try to revoke the degrees of anybody that has a Harvard degree who maybe disagrees with the various faculty at Harvard University. So we're talking about, for example, the press secretary, Kayleigh McEnany, or we're talking about Ted Cruz, Senator Ted Cruz, or, of course, even Ben Crenshaw and some of the others, Dan Crenshaw, I should say. So just a lot of topics that we are going to be addressing in the next couple of hours. But next hour, let me, as a program note, mention that we'll have George Barna with us, and he has actually put together a post-election survey through the Cultural Research Center, so we'll be talking with him as well. But the first half hour here, we want to talk with Ethan Richardson. He is a contributor and former editor for Mockingbird Ministries, and, of course, one of those individuals that was part of the Mockingbird magazine. His article, which I have in front of me here, is Waiting on the New Thing Coming. Not only a writer, but a therapist who lives in Virginia with his wife and one-year-old. And so, Ethan, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thanks for having me, Kerby.
Let's talk about this idea. We live in a world right now where whether we talk about your dad or all of us, especially if you've ever been in the military, hurry up and wait. Or even if you haven't been in the military. And in some respects, you're talking about this idea of waiting on the new thing coming. And you want us to understand that in some respects, the wait times really are shrinking. We get things faster and faster. You know, I've seen people tapping on the top of a microwave saying, gosh, this is taking so long. And I'm thinking, really? I mean, there's something seriously wrong with the impatience that we have. And so, but that's one of the reasons you wrote this, because waiting is part of the Christian life. It's part of just being a human being. But sometimes we need to have the right attitude towards it, don't we?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, so in the article, I sort of talk about how there's, wait times are definitely shrinking thanks to Amazon and fast food and Grubhub. And, you know, there's so many ways now to get exactly what you want when you want it. But in some ways, that's made us more impatient than ever because we can have things on our terms. And because we can have things on our terms, it doesn't change the appetite for more. And so, in the article I talk about the difference between sort of transactional waiting, the waiting for your package to come, and the more existential waiting or longing, the waiting on God. And with that kind of waiting, what comes isn't necessarily going to come on your terms, and definitely is not going to come according to your timeline.
Well, and again, you use the examples that you have a 1-year-old. I certainly can use that. Those of us that were in the world, and I'm the old guy around the table, before we had things like the internet and Amazon, it would be a long and somewhat tedious process to get the crib, to get the various diapers and the various toys and all those kinds of things. Now, it's almost one-stop shopping. You just pull up these different screens here on Amazon, and in comes to you everything that you need. And so the only wait is that 9 months wait before you actually have a birth. But all the other working and waiting has been sort of simplified, hasn't it?
Yeah. I mean, certainly you can definitely just like people have wedding registries, they have baby registries, and you can certainly turn that nursery into your own special place in no time. But the other thing that I was sort of talking about in the article was that it's called transactional waiting, not just because we're buying things, but because it helps us to in some way kind of off-put the anxiety that we're feeling about the actual thing that's coming, the baby coming, the change in our life. And whether you're waiting on a baby or you're waiting on a diagnosis or you're waiting on something to change in your life, sometimes in order to deal with that excruciating wait, we off-put that anxiety into something that we can actually have a handle on. So we buy the crib, and, we do the small tasks that we can control to feel a little bit more in control.
But again, one of the things you point out is some of the waiting is difficult. Your stepdad died of cancer, and you think of the waiting that your mom went through because there's a sense in which you know what's coming and you know the future, but it's the difficult day by day, and oftentimes it's not exactly on your own terms. It's on the terms that's determined by the cancer, it's determined by the doctor, it's determined by the treatment, and a variety of things that are completely outside of your control.
Certainly. Yeah. So, a big chunk of the essay, I sort of talk about what that was like for my mom. And for anybody who's listening who's gone through cancer treatment, either as a caregiver or the person in question receiving treatment, there's a whole host of new lifestyles that you have to adopt. And being a caregiver for someone who's terminally ill is its own job. There's plenty of things to do, and there's plenty of new tasks to take on. And in some ways, they can be kind of a delightful distraction, a way to not think about the inevitable, if it is in fact inevitable. And so there was that going on, while at the same time these burning existential questions: where is God in this? Where is God going to show up? And when is this new thing going to approach? Talking a little bit about how both of those things are happening in tandem, both when we're suffering and when we're waiting for something new and exciting like a baby coming.
Yes. Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll get into this in a few more minutes, then we'll move on to some of the issues in the news. But you think about Psalm 46, "Be still and know that I am God." And certainly this issue of waiting, very important. And so we'll talk about a couple of points, and then also just introduce you to Mockingbird Magazine, which is where this appears. And if you'd like to print it out, I think you're going to find some great material that will help you in the Christian life. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Now that the state legislatures are back in session, one of the more significant functions this year will be reapportionment. After the census is completed, the states must reapportion the congressional districts. This is necessary for two reasons. First, the populations within states change. Second, the population of states vary because of migration from one state to another. Reapportionment will affect two issues. The allocation of the 435 seats in the House of Representatives is done by population within a state. Many states will lose one or more seats, while others will gain one or more seats. This will also impact the Electoral College. The number of electors is based on the number of members of Congress. According to an unofficial Census Bureau estimate, many of the blue states will lose members of the House of Representatives. For example, New York could lose one or two congressional seats depending on which estimate is used. It could lose one seat if the April 1st population estimate is used. It could lose two seats if the July 1st estimate is used. Other states that will lose a congressional representatives are California, Illinois, Michigan, Minnesota, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, and West Virginia. Before I list the states that will pick up a congressional seat, we should mention that this is the first time in its history that California will lose a seat. Also consider that New York was the most populous state in the Union until 1964. It is now fourth and losing population nearly every day. The biggest winner in all of this is Texas, that will gain 3 additional seats. Florida will gain 2. Other states to gain a seat are Arizona, Colorado, North Carolina, and Oregon. And a large number of the state legislatures doing reapportionment are controlled by Republicans. So I predict that more Republicans will be serving in Congress in the future. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of the booklet, A Biblical View on Pornography, go to viewpoints.info/pornography. That's viewpoints.info/pornography.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation for a few more minutes with Ethan Richardson, author of this particular article, Waiting on the New Thing Coming, which appears in the Mockingbird magazine. And Ethan, for just a minute, let's talk about that, because David Saul, I think, is how we first connected up with you. He's the director of Mockingbird Ministries and editor-in-chief of the blog. But this is a resource that we wanted our listeners to know about, and so if they would like to find it, they can just click on your picture there. Right beneath that, we have, of course, the article that is entitled Waiting on the New Thing. And I saw kind of an advanced copy before I saw all the great diagrams, pictures, and other things, so that makes it even more interesting. And then, of course, we have a link to ember.com. But talk about that, because this is not only an article I think people might be interested in, but it's a source for other articles that they might want to know about as well.
Yeah, so Mockingbird Ministries is a ministry that initially started in New York City. We're now based in Charlottesville, Virginia, and our mission is really just to preach the gospel, the good news of Jesus, and doing so by looking at the message of grace and where the message of grace surfaces in culture, both within churches and within Scripture, but also in TV shows and pop culture, and also in everyday life. So the magazine, this is actually the last issue that I am the editor-in-chief for. It comes out quarterly, and each issue we cover a theme. And so the one we're talking about today comes from the future issue. which is the 15th issue.
Well, again, future very important. We oftentimes talk about trends and the rest. But let me not only put on your hat as a writer, but maybe also add the hat of a therapist, because you talk about the fact that there's a fair amount of anxiety, you think, especially having this last pandemic. And so sometimes people use ways to control anxiety. And you say part one, they implement several transactional methods to end your weight. And we just already sort of talked about that a little bit. Well, the second is you finally learn to release your grip, resign yourself to waiting and to God giving you a future and really being patient for that. And it seems to me that we see that so often in the scriptures, and we should also see it in our own lives, shouldn't we?
Yeah, I think so. I think in Scripture we see uncertain futures everywhere, and more often than not, the people of the Bible are people like you and me, and they don't like to wait, and so what they do instead is they forge other gods that will give them what they want when they want it. But the pursuit of God and the pursuit of God bringing the new thing coming is undeterred, despite the fact that we are faithless. He is faithful, and while we have anxiety about the future, the eyes of faith see a God who only gives good gifts, and if we can see with the eyes of faith, we can walk forward into a future that is uncertain, knowing that it's held in secure hands. So,
sure. Let me, if I can, encourage people maybe to write this down or pull out their Bible, because the title really comes from Isaiah chapter 43. See, I am doing a new thing. Now it springs up. Do you not perceive it? And, of course, the title of your article is Waiting on the New Thing Coming. But as you point out, if indeed we aren't waiting on the Lord, then you talk about the fact that we tend to wait on the wrong thing. And so in some respects, there is a sense in which, okay, we don't have idolatry today in the sense that people, as you go into their homes, have idols on the mantle. Although I have been in a few places that have, if they've come from maybe other countries or other religions. But we do have those kind of idols, because sometimes what we do is we replace God with other things, so we tend to wait on the wrong thing. Fair?
Yeah. So, I think there's a quote in there from Leslie Jameson, who's a favorite writer of ours, and she's talking about her experience in the recovery movement and her experience of grace in recovery. And one of the things she says is grace works like a vending machine, except what you wanted to come out of the vending machine was cookies, and what you got instead was seltzer water. And so grace isn't always the thing you plan for, but it is the thing that you get, and the thing that God gives you. I think that's true in Scripture too. I mean, while everybody was waiting for, the rider on the white horse, they missed the lowly lover of sinners who came on the donkey. And so I think it's human nature that while we're waiting, we expect something big and colossal and great to come. And sometimes it's just the whisper that comes and brings peace. And that's what we actually need.
One other thing I thought I would just add is, if you think a wait is a long time, and if you're waiting on a baby, 9 months, for those of us that write a book and then wait a lot longer than you have to wait sometimes for a baby for the publisher to finally put it out, those are still small comparison to one illustration you use, and that is the Methuselah date palm. And I've traveled to Israel a few times. As a matter of fact, some people were asking, are we going again? And we will be doing an Israel trip in September. We're doing Greece the following September, pushing it out far enough so that we can get past this COVID-19. But when I was there, and of course you talk about this, they actually found this seed, and it's a 2,000-year-old seed, was found in an archaeological dig. Somehow it was kind of preserved in a silt bed, and so then it just kind of sat on a lab desk drawer for about 30 years. But then in 2005, somebody said, you know what? this might be a viable seed. They plant it in some soil, and guess what? We have an ancient date palm with now dozens and dozens of new ancient offsprings. And that was a waiting period of about 2,000 years, wasn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. I was just thinking, so many of Jesus' parables have to do with seeds and things disappearing, yeast and dough, and how the work of God is so often tiny, tiny work, almost imperceptible to our eyes until it takes root. And sometimes it doesn't take root when we're watching. Moses had to let his people go. He didn't get to see the promised land, and so often the thing that we're waiting for shows up, but it's not recognizable. There's something mysterious about God's work that is sometimes hidden from our eyes, but nonetheless, with the eyes of faith, we can hold fast to the trust that something is happening beneath the soil, especially in 2021 as we're looking into a new year and kind of wiping the dust off the soles of our feet from 2020. We're certainly clinging to hope that there is newness of life.
Just before we go, let's talk about what, again, is available through Mockingbird. It's ember.com, and I wanted people to know about that, and we've oftentimes talked about how important culture is. Matter of fact, one of my books deals with media and culture, and we've oftentimes said that politics is downstream from culture, and you're doing, I think, a very good job of looking at our culture from a biblical point of view with a grace-oriented philosophy. So if somebody says, I'd like to see a copy of that magazine, or I might even want to subscribe, how can they do so?
Yeah, so they can go to magazine.ember.com, or they can go to ember.com and there's a I'm New Here button, and if you want to get sort of acquainted with sort of where we're coming from and some of our greatest hits, that's a great way to do it. But yeah, that's the easiest way, and we cover all swaths of life. It's a really, really great ministry, and I hope your listeners find it useful.
And I might just mention that this article, Waiting on the New Thing, is the second article. First one is MLK's True Revolution of Values Begins with Mercy of the Cross. That's by Ben Self. So you can find some things that we'll be talking about after we let Ethan go. And thank you so very much for writing the article, and thank you for giving us some time today here on Point of View.
Thank you, Kerby.
We are going to take a break, and when we come back, just wanted to talk real briefly about the connection between religious liberty and Martin Luther King, or the whole civil rights movement. And, of course, Saturday was the Religious Freedom Day. I shouldn't say, of course, because I suspect most of you did not know, but it was. And then this is MLK Day, and I think Lathan Watts does a good job of making a connection between the two. We so often talk about religious liberty here. Last Friday, of course, we had Kelly Shackelford. This Friday, we'll have Penna Dexter and Kelly Shackelford. We'll be talking about it again. But in some respects, we owe a debt of gratitude to pastors and to people in pulpits, and they were the ones that led many of those social revolutions. So we're going to talk about that right after these important messages.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, we're going to cover a lot of different topics in the next half hour. And then we're going to have George Barna with us. And he has actually put together a post-election survey through the Cultural Research Center. And I'm looking forward to that, but I'm not as prepared for it. You know, every once in a while people say, well, how much reading do you have to do? Well, first of all, quite a bit. Second of all, some of the reading has to happen while I'm doing the show. This is what is so crazy, because George Barna's piece that we're going to be talking about comes out tomorrow through the Cultural Research Center. So we head home on Friday, and I've not seen it, and then I have it now put in my hands. The summary of this survey is 5 pages, so you can imagine how much longer the other part of those is. And so, you know, we'll just learn as we go along here, but hopefully he can help me through some of that. So that's just the nature of what happens here, as so much is coming fast and furious. But let's at least acknowledge that we're in the midst of MLK Day. You probably noticed that you're not getting any mail, you're not going to a bank, government services are closed, and yet at the same time, I appreciate Lathan Watts, who's been on the program with us many times before with First Liberty, that he says really he thinks there's a very strong connection which we should make between Religious Freedom Day, which took place last Saturday, and Martin Luther King Day, which happens today. And that is because the two are obviously connected. He says the freedom that was given to not only Martin Luther King Jr., but all sorts of leaders in the civil rights movement was due to the fact that they were endowed by their creator and protected by the First Amendment, and that allowed them to issue a clarion call to the countrymen to succeed where the forefathers had failed, to live up to the uniquely American promise, Lathan Watts says, and deliver the rest of the freedoms denied to him and so many others. And then talks about the fact that if you think about this in terms of history, by the way, the 1776 project report is being delivered today. We'll talk more about that tomorrow once I get a chance to see that report, because I'm not going to talk about a report I haven't seen. That's even more difficult than trying to summarize one that you were just handed before you go on the air. But nevertheless, let's go back to this, in which he's talking about the fact that if you look at our history, the Pilgrims, pastors, preachers, and others, they were the ones that really led the way in so many social movements. We can talk about the American independence in the 18th century. We can talk about the abolition of slavery in the 19th century. We can talk about the civil rights movement in the 20th century. And I could add the temperance movement, the abolition movement, and the suffrage movement, and all sorts of other things that are all part of that. But nevertheless, he goes on to point out that our founding fathers knew that because all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with unalienable rights, the first duty of mankind is the expression of gratitude to the Creator. This is, he says, the essence of worship. The founders also knew that it was not for government to decide how or if that gratitude would be expressed. Any attempt to compel one individual to think a certain way would be a violation of what we today actually enshrine into the First Amendment. And it goes on to talk about, of course, the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. But nevertheless, oftentimes on Martin Luther King Day, I have a commentary that might be on, say, the letter from Birmingham jail. I thought this would be a different look, and that is to see the connection and how important religion is and how it was so actually fundamental and foundational to the things that led these social revolutions. So let's move from there to some other issues. Can you impeach the president once he's left office? Should we sue Twitter? Okay, those are a couple of questions people are asking right now. Alan Dershowitz has been on the program with us before, actually a former Harvard University professor and constitutional law expert, was on a program yesterday, and he said there is no jurisdiction for this. You cannot put a citizen Trump on trial, said Alan Dershowitz. He said if you could do that, it would be putting someone on trial who is not a sitting president, and the implications of that, he says, would be horrendous. He said if you can impeach anyone who's not a sitting president, there are no limits to the power of Congress to try ordinary citizens. It's plainly unconstitutional, and the Senate should not proceed with this unconstitutional act. By the way, he also at that time criticized the attempt at Harvard University to remove the degrees from Trump officials and allies. That'd be like White House Press Secretary Kylie McEnany, and Senator Ted Cruz, Representative Dan Crenshaw, and some of those, and we'll get to that in just a minute. But nevertheless, I think the argument keeps coming down that if indeed you are not going to impeach and remove the president before Wednesday, well, then he's out of office, so you can't remove a person that's already been removed. And so then you could maybe have a vote as to whether or not you would allow him to run for office again, but that would be not an impeachment. But we'll see where that takes us in the next couple of days. But I thought I would try to answer this question that some people are asking. Can you sue Twitter? I'm not sure you can. I'm not sure it's a good idea, but I wanted to at least give you some of the arguments that are surfacing, and in the process kind of made me think about some things that hadn't crossed my mind. Kevin McCullough has been on the program here, and he actually has said that in recent days there have been a number of conversations by former Twitter users that thousands of people might not only be eligible to sue Big Tweet, but expect a bit of a payday for doing so. So these are his arguments. I'm not necessarily agreeing with that, but we do know that the stock value of Twitter has dropped precipitously. Probably in his article, he says close to $7 billion in actual dollars in terms of, market value. But here are some of the reasons why we think, at least he thinks, might happen. One would be the issue of the fact that it's a monopoly, and the monopolization has then led to the sheriffing, as he calls it, or misinformation, which has actually led to interference with free speech in the election cycle. He then goes on to a second point, and that is the violation of what is called the Rule 230. That has to do with the fact that in the Communications Decency Act, there is a section called Section 230, which treats these social media organizations as platforms, and platforms pretty much allow people to post just about anything versus a publisher that is going to be heavily editing what is said. Well, we've talked about this in the program and recognize there's a fair amount of editing taking place. But his third and fourth one I thought were even more intriguing, because number one, he talks about double standards in rule enforcement. He says what he found is that his own Twitter channel was suspended for a supposed threat of violence. You can go read the articles and say no, but anything that sometimes is disagreed with or calling for us to stand up for our rights, sometimes that's perceived as violence. And he points out that on his radio program, because Kevin McCullough has a radio program, he had David Marcus, who's a writer for The Federalist, who went out and pointed out all sorts of things that are on Twitter that are still there. Assassinate Trump, kill Trump, all sorts of things. And so you see kind of the double standard. The Twitter account for the Iranian Supreme Leader is on there. Of course, we've mentioned Communist China and a variety of others. So there's been an uneven enforcement of the rules. And then the fourth point, which I really thought was intriguing, is what he calls reckless and purposeful fiduciary liability. He said, look, I'm not a lawyer, nor am I an investment or financial planning expert, but he says, I've worked for media companies, and I know what's important in the boardroom and what's important to the companies and its audience. Well, by banning Donald Trump essentially for life, they have ruined the possible audience for the various advertisers. He runs the numbers. I'll trust him because they're pretty complex, but he looks at the number of platforms, impressions, and things like that. And the best estimate he comes up with is President Trump, during his 4 years, when you had his tweets, the retweets, and the other references to the tweets, has probably delivered 117 billion impressions, not million, 117 billion impressions during that period of time. Considering, he says, we're a nation of roughly 300 million consumers, that level of engagement from an audience standpoint is unlike any other messaging ability that has ever been created. And now the point. The investors and the people that were actually hoping that Twitter would be selling ads, they've lost an audience, a huge audience. And advertisers, of course, pay for the eyeballs that are seeing your messages. And by just taking, first of all, just Donald Trump, not to mention all of his associates, you have, of course, decreased rather dramatically what ad revenue you could actually bring in simply because you think the president of the United States is a threat. And so it does raise some interesting questions. I hadn't even thought about just the incredible financial implications of taking the most popular tweeter out there off of the website and then losing over time what had been billions of impressions and maybe even possibly billions of impressions in the future. Fascinating. Anyway, we'll take a break. A lot more to cover. We will do so right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, let me just mention that at the top of the hour, we're going to be talking with our friend George Barna, who has done a post-election survey, and he's found some things that are relevant to some of the material we're going to cover this section as well. And that is when you do a survey of those individuals, whether they were Trump supporters or Biden supporters, on a number of issues, we have broad bipartisan support. These are such things as increasing U.S. manufacturing jobs, rebuilding the nation's infrastructure, making Social Security and Medicare financially solvent, reducing the federal debt. But then you have others where there is a striking difference. And in some respects, that's where he gets into what some people are, if you will, misunderstanding what he calls the Biden mandate. Because Joe Biden was elected, everybody agrees with that. No, they don't, and we'll get into those in just a minute. But I think as a great illustration of that, what about this issue of censorship? I mean, it even came up yesterday in my Sunday school class afterwards. We were talking about, well, we do have to censor some things, and you know what? That's a good point. Jim Dennison, in his piece today on the Daily Article, talks about the fact that there are 3 reasons censorship is escalating, and one, which is a good reason for censorship, is that we're facing some real threats. You might say, well, what should we censor? Well, I don't know. Let's start with sex trafficking. Do you want sex trafficking on social media? No, you don't. I don't care if you're a Republican or a Democrat, a Christian or an atheist. I don't care if you're a liberal or conservative. You don't want sexual trafficking on those websites. Let's try another one, child pornography. Now, I did have a debate about pornography because there you get some that, well, you know, we should allow that. No, but most of us, at least I think, can agree on child pornography should not be on these social media websites, and yet it's exploding online, as is sex trafficking online, oftentimes in the dark web, but nevertheless. Cyber terrorism, that's another threat. So let's be honest. Obviously, we do censor certain things because, after all, even if you are a libertarian and believe in the free flow of information, you got to say, okay, we got to draw the line in a few places, but just a few places, you may say, and some of us may draw the line a little bit differently. Well, let's face it, when we're talking about some of these threats, that is certainly the case. There's a second reason why censorship is escalating, according to Jim Dennison, and that is because non-evangelicals consider biblical morality to be hateful and prejudiced. In other words, if you say something about homosexuality, well, that's hate speech. If you say something about transgenderism, well, that's hate speech. You know, frankly, right now, if you even have questions about how free and fair the election was, that might even be called hate speech. So you have a lot of people wanting to completely shut down any kind of debate and discussion, which, of course, gets us to the third point that Jim Dennison makes, and that is our culture has no objective basis for determining truth. We have this kind of postmodern relativism, which is, as he said, convinced our culture that all truth claims are personal and subjective, and so as a result, there isn't really any truth. Now, we as Christians believe that there is truth. Certainly, Jesus says that if you abide in my word, you are truly my disciples. You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. It is amazing how many times if you go to a university, and I've spoken at a lot of universities over the years, you'll see the truth will set you free, maybe even above one of the entrances to one of the university classrooms, but they always take out the other part of that. But nevertheless, this idea of truth is really under attack today, and so that is the case. Which brings me to at least my final point or two, and then we'll get into some of the other articles we've posted on the website, and that is what I call the purge. Now, the purge so far has been things like, well, we're just going to take Donald Trump off of Facebook, Twitter forever, and we'll take some of the other associates off of there, Sidney Powell or a variety of others. But nevertheless, and then we also will maybe remove for a period of time former congressmen and others that are there on that website, or individuals that are various political activists. But the purge actually might just be beginning, because the other day the CEO of Mozilla said that deplatforming people from their services was not enough. He says the real change is going to come when more than just there is a temporary silencing or a permanent removal of bad actors. We've got to do more. And over the weekend, we have a very alerting kind of comment being made by a former Facebook chief security officer, Alex Stamos, who actually called for carriers like Verizon and AT&T to deplatform One America News Network, OANN, and Newsmax. This was on a CNN report. And so you're starting to see just kind of a push in that regard, and others that are just simply saying, now that we've gotten this started, we now know that the Democratic-controlled Congress is not going to intervene, so we can take it upon ourselves to deplatform as many people as we think should, and maybe even tell people no longer to even have an opportunity to have access to the various followers. just the other day, GoDaddy was saying they pulled off, I think, a gun forum for AR-15, and just, it's, I think there are going to be a whole lot more shoes dropping. Which brings me to my fourth article. We'll get to some of the others I skipped over in just a minute in the next hour. And this is from Jonathan Turley. You might remember he's a lawyer with George Washington University. He has made it very clear that he doesn't necessarily agree with some of the statements being made by these individuals who Harvard now said should rescind their degrees. But he says this is just outrageous of some of the things that you're seeing now in this latest attempt. It's a petition being signed by lots of individuals at Harvard, is that they should rescind the degrees of White House Press Secretary Kayleigh McEnany, Senator Ted Cruz, Representative Dan Crenshaw. Just the other day, Representative Elise Stefanik was removed from a high-ranking board on Harvard just simply because she challenged the election. And he points out that the revocation of degrees would result in immediate, and he says likely successful court challenges. He's a law professor, so he might know. He says, I can't even imagine a court allowing such an action to occur on this basis. Well, I appreciate his optimism, but I'm not so sure. He says, more importantly, it's wrong. It's using academic degrees as a vehicle for political expression and retaliation. And so he says, even though I may fundamentally disagree with some of the people who wanted to challenge the electoral votes, such retaliation is not just fueling our divisions, but it's a part of a widening campaign against free speech. And yet the argument in the petition is that really Harvard had no qualms about rescinding offers of admission to high school students because of something they said. You've seen some of them in Snapchat maybe 5 years ago or something like that. But holding teenagers, they said, accountable is easy. Harvard should now have the will to hold adult insurrectionists to the same standards. And he said, this is chilling. There is a vast and obvious difference between withdrawing an offer of admission and revoking an earned degree. And so, if nothing else, he also ends his piece by saying what is most concerning is that faculty members at Harvard and other schools are now creating blacklists and taking retaliatory actions against people who were supportive of or served in the Trump administration. So, as I've said before, the purge seems like it's just getting started, and maybe cooler heads will prevail, but this is something we have been wondering about for some time, and we'll see how that plays out over the next couple of days and weeks. Let's take a break, though. George Barna has done a very good job, as always, of surveying so many individuals, and there's a strike difference between Biden supporters and Trump supporters on some issues, and then there's agreement on other issues. And so we'll see how much unity we're going to have in the next couple of months under a Biden administration, and we'll talk about that with George Barna right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Yes, we're going to spend some time talking with our good friend George Barna, because he has done a very good post-election survey. And this is so hot off the press that if you go to the second page, you will see the release date is January 19th. If you look at your calendar, it's Monday, January 18th. You're going to see it just before almost anybody else has a chance to see it. And so that is something we are making available to you today. Then after our conversation with him, we'll get back into some of the articles I've posted. One by Representative Dan Crenshaw on the illogical lockdowns. We're also going to get into some of the issue of vaccines and even this idea of a vaccine bill of rights. And then we'll get into some of the other articles we've posted, one by Senator Ben Sass and others. But George Barna is a good friend, and he is the professor at Arizona Christian University, also the president of the Cultural Research Center, of course, the founder originally of the Barna Research Group, and he joins us now by phone. So, George Barna, thank you so very much for joining us.
Kerby, it's great to be with you again.
We've had, as you point out in this opening statement here, the most contentious presidential election, at least in modern times. And yet, even in the midst of the incredible division and polarization, if I'm reading this report correctly, we still have on a number of issues what you call a supermajority. That's where nearly 2/3 of Republican voters, nearly 2/3 or more of Democratic voters agree. And so even though in a minute we'll also talk about the attempt to push forward what I think is a misunderstanding of the so-called Biden mandate, for a few minutes, let's focus on this, because you found that there's still a lot of areas of agreement, and that is something that you wouldn't know if you were to simply watch the mainstream press that keeps talking about division and polarization.
Yeah, it's true. And Kerby, when I was analyzing the data from this survey, one of the things that it brought to mind was the many churches that I've worked with over the course of time that have had splits or divisions or real problems of unity within the congregation. One of the things that the pastors often said to their people was, hey, let's try to focus on the things that we agree on. Because when we do that, we're going to find out that there's more that we agree on than some of these little things that we're fighting over today. And as I looked at this data from this nationwide survey that we did, that same thought struck me that, watching the various news programs, looking at a lot of online information that comes through, you think, oh my gosh, nobody could bring this nation together. And yet when I look at the data, what I find is that there are at least 6 different areas. And of course, we couldn't poll on every issue out there, but we looked at, roughly 24 or so. And what we found is that there are 6 where you've got at least 2/3 of each of those groups, the Trump voters and the Biden voters, that are supporting it. So things like increasing the number of manufacturing jobs in America. Now, in this survey, we focused on manufacturing jobs. I bet if we had expanded it and talked about all kinds of jobs, we would have had another point of agreement. But, in this case, we had 83% of all adults, including 87% of Trump voters and 84% of Biden voters, saying, yeah, that's something that we can get behind. We look at something like investing heavily in restoring the nation's infrastructure. Here again, 81% of all adults, including 83% of Trump voters, 84% of Biden voters. We go down through, making Social Security and Medicare financially solvent. 4 out of 5 people want to see that happen. reducing federal government debt. More than 3/4 of all people, regardless of who they voted for, want to see that happen. Reducing federal income taxes for individuals. Interestingly, 3 out of 4 people in America want to see that, regardless of who they voted for. And increasing school choice that's available to parents and families. Again, about 3 out of 4 Americans are saying, yeah, that ought to be on the agenda. So you look at that, I mean, that would be a pretty robust first year of activity for any president. And so if we want to have this opportunity to bring America back together, to heal the nation, to unify the nation around particular policies that we all agree on, I think these 6 areas will be a great starting point.
And again, let me just point out that before I knew what your group was, and then I started looking at it before I went to the second page, I said, well, the first 4, yeah, I can understand that. Manufacturing jobs, infrastructure, Social Security, federal debt, those are kind of boilerplate kind of issues and issues that most people would agree. I wouldn't have predicted maybe reducing federal income tax, because we're always hearing about we got to raise the tax of the wealthy and those kinds of things. And I certainly would not have predicted increased school choice. Because, as you well know, the Democratic Party, I think in large part influenced by the teachers' unions, have always said they're against school choice. But I think in each one of these 6 cases that you have listed, there is a supermajority, and it illustrates that sometimes even the leaders of the party, either on the Republican side or the Democratic side, sometimes they aren't looking at the data to recognize that not only their voters, but the voters of the other party agree with them. And that seems to be a way forward if indeed you were really looking to bring about some kind of unity in the country.
Yeah, I mean, it'll be interesting to see what the inauguration brings about in terms of, the talk about where we're going to go as a country. But a lot of people are expecting there to be verbiage about unity. And, I'm just hoping that this isn't the Communist Party sense of unity, which means nobody having a different opinion than that of the leadership. I'm hoping that this is really, we're here to represent the people. Let's figure out what you want and let's get it done. And I do think this would be a great start.
We're going to, in just a minute, of course, talk about the radical differences here. But certainly you do see some of those even before we take the break when you talk about the view of racial discrimination, environmental standards, immigration, and the rest. So we recognize we don't want to be Pollyanna here. Some of these very deep divisions do exist. But still, it's encouraging and maybe even heartening to see that can't we at least agree on a few things? And the answer is actually we can agree on a tremendous number of these things.
Yeah, I mean, if nothing else, this has encouraged me to hopefully be able to fund more research where we'll be able to look at even more policies. I would think it would be enormously helpful for our elected leaders if they had this kind of information to guide them forward, helping them to think through, what kind of policies could we be pursuing? And when we talk about working across the aisle, well, this is the ideal opportunity because nobody's constituency is going to complain that they back these kinds of things. And I'm willing to bet, since we could only look at a limited number of policy areas in this one particular survey, with subsequent surveys, we might be able to identify many more areas where we would reach consensus.
Okay, well, let's get back into this after the break, because you might remember Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi, as well as some others, have all talked about the fact that Joe Biden has a mandate to implement his progressive agenda. Well, first of all, this has been a very close election. I think it was closer than some people will like to acknowledge in the mainstream press, but we'll leave that for a conversation another day. But there are some striking differences between, say, Trump supporters and Biden supporters, Trump voters and Biden voters. So we're going to come back and talk about some of those because in addition to the areas of commonality, there are some very significant differences, and we want to talk about those as well. If you find yourself saying, well, I'd like to read this for myself, well, we've posted it on the website. Might even turn to the third page there because that's what we're going to be talking about right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Now that the state legislatures are back in session, one of the more significant functions this year will be reapportionment. After the census is completed, the states must reapportion the congressional districts. This is necessary for two reasons. First, the populations within states change. Second, the population of states vary because of migration from one state to another. Reapportionment will affect two issues. The allocation of the 435 seats in the House of Representatives is done by population within a state. Many states will lose one or more seats, while others will gain one or more seats. This will also impact the Electoral College. The number of electors is based on the number of members of Congress. According to an unofficial Census Bureau estimate, many of the blue states will lose members of the House of Representatives. For example, New York could lose one or two congressional seats depending on which estimate is used. It could lose one seat if the April 1st population estimate is used. It could lose two seats if the July 1st estimate is used. Other states that will lose a congressional representatives are California, Illinois, Michigan, Minnesota, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, and West Virginia. Before I list the states that will pick up a congressional seat, we should mention that this is the first time in its history that California will lose a seat. Also consider that New York was the most populous state in the Union until 1964. It is now fourth and losing population nearly every day. The biggest winner in all of this is Texas, that will gain 3 additional seats. Florida will gain 2. Other states to gain a seat are Arizona, Colorado, North Carolina, and Oregon. And a large number of the state legislatures doing reapportionment are controlled by Republicans. So I predict that more Republicans will be serving in Congress in the future. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of the booklet, A Biblical View on Pornography, go to viewpoints.info/pornography. That's viewpoints.info/pornography.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
George Barna with us with the Cultural Research Center at Arizona Christian University. If you'd like to know a little bit more, we have a link to that on the website. You might want to subscribe to the material that we're talking about. Of course, we've also posted a day early, actually, this post-election survey, which begins by certainly talking about some places and some issues where there is really essentially a supermajority. More than 2/3 of Republican voters, more than 2/3 of Democratic voters on what you might even call win-win policy issues that certainly need to be the kinds of things that need to be addressed. But the reality is, George, as you well know, that on Wednesday when we hear incoming President Joe Biden, he's going to talk about some other issues where there is a very significant difference in terms of universal health care, in terms of the issue of racial discrimination, immigration, certainly the issue of abortion, the use of fossil fuels, gun ownership, and the rest. And there's where you do see a very striking difference between Trump voters and Biden voters, don't you?
Yeah, as we look at all of those kinds of issues, I mean, that's where this idea of unity pretty much falls apart. And so if there are going to be legal changes, we need to be really careful about how that gets navigated. Because if the idea is to bring in healing and unity and mutual understanding and restore that notion that we're really one country, we need to understand each other and work together, you know, putting some of these things in right now is only going to raise tensions. It's not going to advance that unity agenda. So we've got to look very carefully at these things. I mean, some of them are kind of red meat liberal issues, and so I would expect him to be talking about them. But, it's really not going to bode very well for the start of his administration if he starts to push those from day one.
And again, part of this is style and part of it is substance. There was a time, and since you and I are a little bit older, we might remember a time when there was a recognition that certain issues might be controversial, so you want to use the presidential platform, the bully pulpit, to convince people. And I think Ronald Reagan is a good example of trying to win over individuals so that they will see the value of that particular policy. What we are starting to see now is not only a cancel culture, which says if I don't agree with you, then I want to drive you out of office. I want to cancel your employment, but also I just want to drown you off. I want to censor you. I want to deplatform you. And that's certainly one thing that is, I'm even more convinced, going to backfire, because let's take one where there's a striking difference: set and enforce more stringent environmental standards. You know, if you can get in front of the American people and say, look, we do have some problems in this particular area, whether it's the enforcement of air pollution standards or water pollution standards, and we all want good, clean drinking water, I think some people might say, oh, okay, I go with that. If instead this is going to be used to promote the Green New Deal and drive up the cost of energy and tell anybody that if they don't agree with this, then they're being selfish and they're going to destroy the planet. Well, you can kind of see how style is going to be important even in trying to convince people of the substance of some of these issues, right?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Kerby. You know, and I'd add to that, we also have to be alert to the fact that some of these pushes that we're likely to see are not simply about the policy in question. They're more about completely and radically changing the system of government and how government performs in America than simply changing a law here or there. I'll give you an example. I mean, we can look at the idea of redistributing people's wealth in an effort to substantially reduce income inequalities. And what you find is that 3 out of 4 people who voted for Joe Biden believe that's the way forward for the country. But you have to understand, this isn't just a simple policy where, yeah, we're going to be Robin Hood, we're going to take from the rich and give to the poor. This is really about introducing one of the foundational elements of socialism and totalitarianism. So it really represents a complete shift in government. So when we hear about a lot of these kinds of shifts that the Biden administration may choose to go for, well, it's really not just about changing a few laws. It really is about changing our entire way of life and how government relates to that.
Let's talk about another one that I thought was striking: the changing of the structure of government. Increase the number of U.S. Supreme Court judges from 9, the current number, to 13. I mean, you have almost twice as many Biden supporters accepting that as Trump supporters. And I even wonder how many of some of those, either Trump or Biden supporters, even know how many Supreme Court members there are. But you can see that on that, or another one was really striking, is restrictive laws regarding gun ownership. You have twice as many by percentage of Biden supporters agree with that as Trump supporters. So some of those really are not only hot button issues, but are guaranteed to bring about a significant backlash from millions and millions of Americans.
Yeah, and I think this goes back to what we were talking about earlier, this notion of a mandate. You know, nobody, I teach political science. Nobody that I know of thinks about winning a national election by maybe 4 percentage points. And in addition, losing 25 seats from your party in one of the houses of Congress, and then merely splitting the other house of Congress, having a net gain of 3 seats when there were 34 seats up for election during this term. I mean, nobody would look at that objectively if you didn't attach names and times to it and say, ooh, that's a mandate right there. You can see the people are really moving in that direction. That's not at all what this election showed. So, you know, trying to be objective about this, I would just caution the Democrats to recognize that this is a really vulnerable time in American history. And if they're going to try to lead us, leadership doesn't mean jamming through your fantasies. It really means trying to understand the people who put you in that position to represent them, knowing what they want, knowing what's best for them, not thinking that you always know better than them, that you're part of the quote-unquote elite, but recognizing what it means to have a Republican form of democracy and really to fulfill that mandate more than anything that they're suggesting this election showed them.
And one more example, of course, it's always been a lightning rod issue, the issue of Roe versus Wade and abortion. And whether that moves much, we'll see. But I think it's just an illustration, again, that we do have a very significant amount of agreement on at least 6 points that you've surveyed. And like you said, the more you do this, I bet we could find a few dozen areas of agreement. And that's where I think government can be most effective and move forward, because we do need manufacturing jobs. We do need a better infrastructure. We do need to address some of these issues of the federal debt and Social Security and Medicare and all the rest. But nevertheless, just before I run out of time, let's talk about how people can join with you at the Cultural Research Center, because we have made available here this report on Common Ground. And of course, they will be able to find that tomorrow at the Cultural Research Center. But people can subscribe and receive some of this information, can't they?
Absolutely, yeah. All the work that we do, we put out there for free. We want people to be educated. It's one of the things that bothers me right now is with this whole censorship movement that's going on. The survey is showing me that people need to be educated on a lot of these issues. And so the more we can get the information out there, the better off the nation is going to be. So if they go to culturalresearchcenter.com, they'll be able to subscribe and get the newsletters that we put out every couple of weeks based on our latest research. So we'd love to have more people reading about these things.
And again, we have a link on our website, pointofview.net. You can click on there, the link, and there's a place where it says request info. And of course, most importantly, if you say, well, I want to see this report, well, actually, it won't come out till tomorrow. But if you go to Point of View, you'll see it today. So we wanted to get a first look. And George Barna, as always, thank you for this research. I am looking forward to the next opportunity, because I know you'll bring some more to the table. And it's always great to have you here on Point of View.
Thanks so much, Kerby. I enjoyed it.
We are going to take a break. And as we just mentioned a minute ago, sometimes we have a chance to see something in advance. I sometimes get an advance copy of books and tell you that the book will be out in a couple of weeks and to give you a chance to hear about it. In this particular case, there's kind of a one-page summary, which you can just read real quickly. And then, of course, it goes into some of the detail for the following pages, and we have made it available. You will notice as you go there, it says release date, January 19th. Well, that's tomorrow. Well, we're giving you one-day look, and so you're the first people to have a chance to look at this because of our relationship with George Barna. And again, if you have a member of Congress that you would like to contact, or you would like to maybe post this on your website, or maybe write a op-ed piece or a letter to the editor. It's lots of great information, and it reminds us that in some respects we're more unified than we are divided. But of course, there's in the interest of parties and even the media to keep us divided. And I wanted you to know about this research from George Barna. When we come back, we'll talk about some of these lockdowns and the viruses right after this.
Sometimes I think about seeds. You ever stop to consider that some seeds become entire trees and some trees grow up and produce fruit? Other seeds become flowers or vines that bring us vegetables or berries. And some trees don't have fruit, but they're just pretty, especially in some parts of the country when it comes to the fall colors. Yes, sometimes my mind goes off like that. And I also think about such things when it comes to the seeds that so many have planted in the quest to impact our nation through Point of View Radio. You may think that your gift is a small thing, but like a seed, it can grow to have an impact beyond your imagination. If you want to see beauty again in America, consider planting a seed today and making a difference by joining the Point of View Truth Team. Get the details today, right now, by visiting pointofview.net/team or call us at 1-800-347-5151. Plant a seed for a great future. Cultivate truth. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Well, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. I want to go through a couple of the other articles I've posted for you to read today. This has been all over the map, but let's, if we can, focus on the issue of the lockdowns, the vaccine, and the virus, because there's some things I think we can learn from that. And one of those, Representative Dan Crenshaw wrote a piece called "To Understand Illogical Lockdowns, We Must Understand the Left's Thinking." When I started, I thought, well, he's just going to look at it philosophically. Pretty soon he takes us into brain science, and it was a fascinating piece. Goes on for a couple of pages, so again, I would encourage you to read it in its entirety. But he reminds us that this push for lockdowns is back, and I think we're going to hear that from incoming President Joe Biden. And he says, to many of us, it would appear as if the entire human race, he says, has learned absolutely nothing in the past 8 months, despite the overwhelming evidence that the cost of lockdowns far outweighs the limited benefits. Many policymakers lack the backbone or creativity to come up with any alternative. And he points out that there seems to be a real difference in different areas of the country and from different, if you will, political persuasions. Because he says, you know, for example, in Washington, D.C., I regularly see people wear masks while walking alone in a park. In Texas, I almost never observe this. He says probably because there's no scientific basis for it. But he says research has shown, interestingly enough, that Democrats and Republicans differ in their neural mechanisms activated during risk-taking exercises. This is in what's called the amygdala region of the brain. This demonstrates measurable psychological and physiological differences when confronted with risk. And he gives some good examples. For example, conservatives tend to be more likely to be involved in a risky occupation, for example, the military, law enforcement, loggers. But he said this is really just a lengthy way of explaining the simple observation. Conservatives appear to be less risk-averse to physical threats and therefore far less likely to favor more extreme actions, whereas he says the liberal mind is a belief that almost anything can be solved by government. And so he then talks about the fact of some of the research done by Dr. Jonathan Haidt. If that name is familiar, let me hold up this book. This is the book Closing the American, the Closing of the American Mind. We had Jonathan Haidt on quite a while ago to talk about that book. But I think he's referring to the previous book by Jonathan Haidt, which is this one, which I'm holding up right now, The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. That is by the way, there's a study in there which I've documented before in some of my commentaries that it's interesting. Conservatives more understand liberals than liberals understand conservatives. Likewise, you could also say Christians understand atheists better than atheists understand Christians. And part of that is because if you think about it, we have to live in their world. You go off to a university, you're going to probably have professors that are probably secular, progressive professors. There may be some Christians, I'm not denying that. You read the New York Times, Washington Post, you turn on mainstream television, you're going to get a view that isn't necessarily a Christian view. So oftentimes you have an ability to at least understand the other side. By contrast, those people who hold those views maybe never even see the other side. And he points out in this research by Jonathan Haidt that liberals emphasize, maybe overemphasize what he says, caring and fairness. That's part of that research over other moral considerations. Conservatives, on the other hand, and again, Jonathan Haidt isn't exactly a far-right individual. He's pretty much, left of center for sure. We've interviewed him on this program, and so know him a little bit. But nevertheless, he wants to admit that conservatives, on the other hand, favor all sorts of moral categories equally. They place emphasis not just on compassion, but fair processes, moral authority, tradition, liberty, loyalty. Conservatives are, he says, then more morally balanced, while liberals tend to measure the worth of an action by its issue of compassion. And he says that sort of explains then why liberals routinely, he says, denigrate what he calls contextualized COVID-19 data. In other words, if we see the death count, and I'm going to get into that in just a minute, sometimes people say, well, we should also account for age, comorbidities, and a number of other things when assessing fatalities. And the reaction you get oftentimes from the liberal mind, which is the name of one of my booklets we've just made available, is, well, you're just downplaying the virus, or you're covering for Trump or something like that. And sometimes, as he points out, rational discussions become almost impossible with someone who is convinced that you are morally inferior. So anyway, it's a fascinating piece to start out by recognizing why you have such a striking difference in the view of lockdowns. Also, it, I think, illustrates the difference in terms of vaccines. And I want to talk about vaccines for just a minute, because America's frontline doctors just the other day released what they call the Vaccine Bill of Rights. Now, we'll see whether or not this gets implemented in various legal structures, but they have 6 points. I'm just going to give you 3 of those to give you a sense. One is no persons shall be mandated, coerced, forced, or pressured to take a COVID-19 vaccine. Number 2, no physician or nurse shall be asked by their employer to promote a COVID-19 vaccine. And number 3, all persons reserve the right at all times to determine what is in their best medical interest without threat to their livelihood or freedom of movement. Now, we'll see where that goes, because I get the sense where this is headed right now. This concept being promoted of vaccine passports, of digital health IDs, and other mandates that are starting to surface, which is one of the reasons why the group called America's Frontline Doctors issued this Vaccine Bill of Rights. And we'll probably talk about that some in the future, but I just wanted to to have you think about this. And while we talk about the vaccine, I want to try to tell you as much as we have learned. And one of the concerns is sometimes people come out with a story, and when you don't see the story in any other news area, you wonder, is it true? And so I just will, again, want you to have discernment. You may, if you've been out on the internet, and certainly on Facebook, Twitter, and others, seen some people referring to a study that said 55 people have died in the United States after receiving the COVID-19 vaccines, according to a reporting system. Well, first of all of those stories, most of them are just citing one story, but even if you find other stories, they're citing this original one that comes from Epoch Times. Now, to be fair to them, they point out that this comes from what is called the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System. This is a system which, of course, is implemented by the government to actually have a database to help people begin to understand what are the possible implications or adverse reactions to a vaccine. Now, the point is that the reports can be filled by anyone, so this could be healthcare providers, patients, family members. So I'll give credit to the original article that says, look, often there are details and sometimes even information that might be erroneous. And I think it might be, because we don't see anybody else talking about this. Now, you can start arguing that maybe there's some attempted suppression of this information, but to help you see the contrast, if you do type in, deaths due to COVID vaccine on like a Google search, what will you find? You'll find actually some documentation that comes from Norway of 23 people in Norway after receiving the vaccine have died. Now, again, let's recognize who those were. Of the 23, at least I can tell 13 of them were nursing home patients who are already 80 years of age, and they may have died with the vaccine. They may have died because of the vaccine, because of side effects. So that story does have a number of reports. But when you look for the one for America, well, it all goes back to this one report. And so I'm just, again, saying, if we get more information, we'll bring it to you here on Point of View. But the bottom line is, I think that's a good example of where we just need to exercise a little bit of discernment and say, it's one report. It comes from a reporting system that just about anybody can fill out. And so, again, it's not as clear and it's not as convincing as you might think that it was by just simply reading the headlines. So I want you to exercise discernment, and if we find out more about the impact that this vaccine is having in people's lives, we'll certainly report it. because, I don't have a vested interest one way or the other. I just want you to know the truth. But I do want you at the same time to look at it with a little bit of skepticism at the moment, because we do have pretty good evidence coming out of Norway. I'm not as convinced necessarily that this vaccine adverse event reporting system is as good a system as possible, and we'll just have to see what else we can find out. We come back from the break, though. I want to bring a couple of other stories to the table because these are all relevant as well. If you'd like to join the conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back right after these important messages.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
For a few more minutes, let me just mention that my commentary today is about reapportionment, because after all, your state legislature, in whatever state you are listening right now, will be redesigning and redrawing those lines. So you need to be in contact with the Capitol and with your legislators and make sure that reapportionment is done in a way that is honest and fair. But it also, I think, is going to mean, especially as you see more more and more individuals moving generally from blue states to red states, that you are going to have more influence of red states, which would be Republican. That's going to have an impact on the Electoral College. It's going to have an impact on Congress. I think more and more people are thinking that there may be only 2 years that Nancy Pelosi is going to preside over a Democratic-controlled House of Representatives, and so that's the case. Another issue as well about the issue that we are going to be maybe focusing on tomorrow in my commentary is hidden tribes. It points out in a piece that I've put together that, yes, the two extremes of the political spectrum are vocal and loud and well-funded, but they represent at best maybe 14% of the American population. The other 86% are a lot of us in the middle going, I'm not sure I agree with either side's stridency. And it probably illustrates, again, some of the points we made with George Barna. So that's on the website there. Just before I take some phone calls, let me take a couple of issues, though, that need to be addressed. And one of those is that as President Donald Trump leaves office, like other presidents, they tend to do two things in the last couple of days. Number one, they tend to declassify a lot of information, which frankly should have. Now, if you declassify information that's vital to national security, that would be dangerous. But most of the time, what it is some things just get slapped with a classification, and it's called CYA, cover yourself. And so we are now starting to find that out. And I want to get into one example of that in just a minute, because we're learning a lot more about who is actually involved in the Russia investigation and the Christopher Steele dossier. And you would be surprised, although we gave us some hints back when that was unfolding. The other concern is that oftentimes they tend to pardon a lot of individuals. Bill Clinton, the all-time record holder for pardoning people that should never have been pardoned, but I'm afraid Donald Trump may do some of that as well. My commentary coming out later this week addresses that issue. But let's come back to this issue of actually removing the classification of certain documents. And what have we found? Well, John Solomon, who I quoted the other day, and we actually posted his article yesterday, or Friday, also now Art Moore. I'll just read his piece. Fiona Hill is best known for testifying against President Trump on the House impeachment investigation a year ago. You might remember that she has been a member of the National Security Council, and she testified against the president having to do with the questionable call to the Ukrainian president. And now declassified documents point out that she, as she was criticizing the president previously about Russia, and Russia, as we heard, that there was Russian collusion, and then testified against the president on the phone call to Ukraine. It turns out that these declassified documents, now again I'm quoting from Art Moore, actually show that she had the distinction of introducing former British spy Christopher Steele to the primary source of the infamous dossier of Russian propaganda. I would even say Russian intended disinformation that fueled the Russia collusion probe, and that is due to the information that is coming from people like Art Moore and John Solomon. We knew it, but we didn't know how close she was to all of that. So here you have an individual testifying in front of Congress, arguing for the fact that indeed this is a president that should be impeached. Well, all the time it turns out she's the one that actually introduced, again, Christopher Steele to that dossier, which was a phony dossier, which we also know was most likely paid for by the Clinton campaign. As a matter of fact, this a little bit later says the Obama FBI and Justice Department used the Steele dossier, which was funded by the Democratic National Committee and the Hillary Clinton campaign, as their primary evidence to obtain warrants to spy on the Trump volunteer advisor Carter Page, which we've talked about here before. So as more and more of these declassified documents land, more and more of these shoes will drop, and I think we will actually find out that some of the things we said on this program years ago turned out to be true. So thank you, Mr. President, because that is the case. One of the other issues I thought I'd put on the agenda here is the second article. It's by Senator Ben Sasse. QAnon is destroying the Republican Party from within. Now, again, if I were to go out with a microphone right now and ask most people what's QAnon, most of them possibly couldn't even tell you. It has a conspiracy theory to it, but you saw some of those QAnon people storming the Capitol. Matter of fact, you saw this one individual. It was Douglas Jensen, had a T-shirt. It had a red and white Q on it, red, white, and blue Q on it, which was the insignia of the QAnon conspiracy theory. And Senator Sass is saying, it's about time to actually call out some of these individuals, just as those on the left and the Democratic Party are just doing things which I'm sure the leadership of the Democratic Party just wish they wouldn't talk about. Some of the things being said by the squad, some of the anti-Semitic comments and all the rest. You have some now on the right, and one of those is, Ben Sass says, newly elected Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene is cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. He says she once ranted, there's once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to take this global cabal of Satan-worshiping pedophiles out. And I think we have the president to do that. And he points out that the House Minority Leader, Kevin McCarthy, should have just disavowed her campaign, but he didn't want to lose a Republican seat, so now you've got her in Congress. And, of course, he may be hoping that he can keep the lid on her many crazy ideas, but the bottom line is, guess what? They have social media, and it's just one of those things. And he says, so he really is convinced that the Republican Party really, if it's going to have a future, needs to begin to call out falsehoods and conspiracy theories unequivocally and repudiate those who peddle those lies. He talks about, some of these threatening all sorts of individuals, including even the vice president and Ben Sass and the rest. And so I wanted you to know that article was available because if nothing else, it just many times people say, should I think about this idea of QAnon? And if you've heard about it at all, this 5-page article, I think, goes through it in pretty good detail. But near the end, he also acknowledges something. He says, look, we've lost civic authority. He says political incompetence and malpractice around the COVID-19 pandemic have only deepened suspicions that some politicians will never let a crisis go to waste. You think? He says the decisions in California to keep churches closed, but to keep open strip clubs and marijuana dispensaries baffle Main Street. Similarly, he says the jolting juxtaposition of a media addict mayor breaking up Hasidic funerals while marching in a Black Lives Matter protest not only deepens the cynicism of many Americans, but it undermines the institutions of public health that should have been cautiously protecting their standing. It's a very good piece where he goes beyond just talking about QAnon to just kind of what is the future of the Republican Party, what's the future of the Republic in general. And so it is one of the other articles I've posted there. Is QAnon the biggest issue? No. Is it an issue? Yes. And I wanted you to hear about that because some of you have asked, what is this organization? Why should we be concerned about it? And I think Senator Ben Sass does a pretty good job of giving us a very cogent answer to that as well. Well, Penna Dexter will be sitting into this chair tomorrow. She's got all sorts of people lined up she wants to do an interview with. And then I'll be with you back on Wednesday. Chip Ingram is going to be with us. I'm looking forward to that interview as well as all sorts of other topics we will get into. You can go to our website, pointofview.net, to find the articles we've mentioned. And Andrew and Steve, we want to thank you for your help behind the scenes. And we will see you tomorrow right here on Point of View.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Okay, this would be Monday, January 25th, in 3, 2, 1. Will the federal government move to regulate big tech? I think that is unlikely for many reasons I will delineate in a moment, but I can't deny that there is growing